Good morning, everyone. It's a nice effect, just to bring attention to myself. Cool. So my name's Chris Ford. I work for a company called ThoughtWorks, who are present at Strange Loop, if you want to check them out. And I always wanted to, well, I guess like many people, I've been interested in books that explain big ideas to me. And often what I wanted is, after I've read that book, I've got so excited that what I really wanted to do is just basically sit down in a room full of people and just talk at them about it for like about 40 minutes. So I guess today my dream has come true. So this book is called African Polyphony and Polyrhythm. And the talk is basically a programmer's response to this book. So the book is what you might call an ethnomusicology book. And so you might say, well, how is that different from any other kind of musicology? And I guess traditionally what that meant was it was the study of music from cultures other than Western cultures. That's certainly got better throughout the 20th century, so now maybe the discipline would be better thought of as the study of music within a particular culture. So this book is by Professor Simha Arom, who's a famous ethnomusicologist. But he started out being trained within the European musical tradition. So he won first prize for French horn in the Parisian Conservatory. So this is someone with kind of serious credentials from the European way of looking at music. And then in, I think it was 1963, Professor Arom, not a professor then, travelled to the Central African Republic. So this is about 3 years after the Central African Republic gained its independence from France. And he was going there to help establish a brass band. I guess this was the idea of some kind of cultural exchange. But it turned out he arrived the day before the National Independence Day of the Central African Republic, which is on the 1st of December. So he gets to his hotel, wakes up the next morning, and the capital, Bangui, is full of music. All sorts of music, and music of a kind that Professor Arom had never really heard before. So he could tell it was amazing, and in the book he describes it as love at first sight. And I guess this particular encounter with this music changed his career. But he didn't really know what kind of music it was, and he didn't really have the background to understand it. So here's some examples of the kind of music from the very varied traditions of the Central African Republic that Arom encountered. So groups of percussion instruments playing tightly interlocked rhythms. So that's where kind of polyrhythm comes in the title of the book. Orchestras of up to 20 wind instruments where each musician plays only a single note. So there's just a single pitched instrument, but the orchestra as a whole plays melodies based on musicians understanding exactly when they need to play within the whole. And choirs singing incredibly complex, yet perfectly coherent contrapuntal music. So what I'm going to do today, with a little bit more background, is I'm going to synthesize examples of the first two kinds of music. I'm not going to show you an example of the third kind, but I will explain why I won't, just as a bit of a tension to lead you on. So Arom says he was conditioned by a cultural background too narrow to allow easy comprehension of this music. Right? So he could tell it was wonderful, he could tell it was rich and complex and worthy of his study, but he had trouble situating it against his traditional European background at the time. So when he come back to the Central African Republic as an ethnomusicologist, he was trying to find out ways of taking these wonderful orchestral pieces or large ensemble pieces and kind of breaking them down so he could analyze them in terms that could make sense to him. So one of the cool innovations that Arom came up with was to use the playback recording technique that's often used in like Western popular music. So the trouble you've got is that if you have a single musician playing a melody, someone who's skilled can write that down, right? They can notate it, they can listen, hear what the notes are up and down. Maybe they'll make a mistake, but it's kind of tractable to an ordinary human musician. But if you have 20 instruments playing at once, different pitches, interlocking in complex ways, it's not really a practical thing. The human ear doesn't scale that well. So what he did was, he wanted to record the musicians separately, but the trouble he ran into was that these musicians weren't used to playing their parts individually. It kind of was like having one side of a conversation without the other. It wasn't really how they're used to experiencing the music. They're used to playing off the other musicians. So what he did was he recorded the ensemble as a whole and then used headphones to allow individual musicians to just play just their part so he could record that separately. But as he notes in the book, it's not really the taking apart of things into individual pieces that was the hard bit. He did that, and it was kind of fine. But what he really wanted to do was find out what were the principles by which these parts came together to form this music. And in the book, as well as talking about the specifics of the Central African Republic's music, he also talks a lot about the methodology of doing this kind of thing. So this realization arrow model, arrow realization, is a schematic that he introduces in the book. And basically the idea is that if you have a performance or a realization, and then you can produce some kind of simplified model of it, and then use that to produce another performance, if the thing that you produce from the model sounds okay, sounds authentic, sounds reasonable, then you've got a reasonable assurance that the way you modeled it in the middle was okay. So if the realizations on either side of the model have the same structural features, you've got proof that your model is coherent. The trouble is, of course, this is a subjective thing, because you will get something slightly different. So you need someone who's a bearer of that tradition of music to say whether or not the output is authentic or whether it's rubbish, basically. And in the case of the way Arom was doing things, and generally in musicology and ethnomusicology, the way you model things is using Western music notation. So you use a score. That's what the model is made of mostly. So I assume probably a lot of people may have encountered it, but basically it's a system of you putting dots on a stave, and how high the dot is tells you how high the pitch is, and where it is horizontally tells you when the note happens. So it's kind of quite a literal data format for turning music into notes on the page. But from a programmer's point of view, you might be able to say that this actually has two purposes. One of which is to allow the person who's notating the music to express themselves, and the other is to allow the musician who's playing the music to understand and play it. So this kind of dual purpose, it does pretty well, but there are some weaknesses in it, which I'll discuss a bit later. So one way you can think of modeling in general is as compression. So JPEG is one way of understanding how images look like. So you could say that using a JPEG on a flat image that has sharply defined lines and clear color palettes, that's going to be an inappropriate way of modeling that image. And when you expand it again and when you display the image again, you're going to get compression artifacts. And that's actually a problem for these models of ethnomusicology as well, that you've really got to try hard to decide what is relevant. So you want to make sure your model has everything that's relevant about the music in it, that you haven't dropped anything that's relevant, and that you haven't introduced any kind of artifacts or extra stuff that isn't supposed to be there. So this idea of relevance is something that Arom talks about quite a bit, and it's not that dissimilar to, I guess, trying to produce a scientific model of a phenomenon. You want to make sure that your laws explain it and that don't add anything extra. There's an example in the book that Arom talks about of maybe you could say an earlier musicologist, ethnomusicologist called Bela Bartok, quite a famous composer. So what Bartok did was, he was Hungarian, and he went and did an investigation of the folk music of his country. So the classical music is well known, but there were a lot of really interesting scales and intricacies of Hungarian folk music that folks hadn't been paying attention to previously. And what he did was he did recordings, he made models of it, he brought it to a wider audience. But there's still a bit of a slightly problematic thing about this process where it took the blessing of a Western art music composer looking at this music for people to regard it as interesting. And the other, I guess, tricky thing is that Bartok used these really interesting folk musics to inspire his classical compositions. But it's his name that's known, right? Not the name of the original musicians that provided him with the source material. So it's kind of a great thing that he did, but on the other hand, there is a bit of a slight, uncomfortable taste of appropriation about some of this, which I'll come back to later. So one example of a compression artifact in modeling other musical traditions is Bartok's B semi-flat. So when he was listening to these folk musicians, he encountered what he thought was a real phenomenon of a note between B and B flat. And so he notated it with B/2. But when other Hungarian musicians went back to the source material later on, they found it wasn't really a real phenomenon, that there was various notes of various different pitches. It wasn't really a real thing. So when Bartok was notating with his B semi-flat, it was something that he'd introduced. It was basically a compression artifact in his understanding of the music. So we want to avoid that as we try to explain other musics. So Arom came to a broad understanding of what Central African music, or many of its forms, is, which is ostinato with variations. So ostinato is a fancy music theoretic term, basically meaning repetition. So repetition with variations. That's the principle at which a lot of these musics are based, and all the ones that I'll show you today are. So each musician basically has their own part, which they kind of play over and over again. That interlocks with the parts of every other musician, and they introduce variation over time. But the complexity of the music comes, I guess, you might say vertically rather than horizontally. So a lot of Western music, it's going somewhere, right? It has a beginning, a middle, and end. It might set up a tension and later resolve it. What the Central African music does to have interest and complexity is more vertical. So you have a fairly short motif that's going round and round and cycling, but within that there's an immense amount of variation and interest. So when I read this, I heard, well, repetition and variation, these are things that programming can do pretty well, right? We know how to repeat things over and over again. We know how to introduce changes. We know how to make models come alive. We know how to make mathematical models into running programs. So maybe this is something that we can do with the musical theory of Arom. And then I read this bit, which almost felt like an invitation to do so. It's slightly sexist phrasing, but basically Arom was saying, well, if the reader wants to use the transcriptions to construct polyrhythmic formulae, if we respect the rules of the grammar, go ahead. Oh, there's an invitation right there on the page. It was great. Then he goes on to say that the combinations should be perfectly acceptable to bearers of the tradition. So Arom's making the claim that his models of the music are kind of sufficiently good that even if it's a bit wonky, what comes out the other side should be authentic enough that someone from the Aka tribe or someone who's a Bandalinda person should be able to recognize it as music from that tradition. And then I remembered the quote at the start of the book, which seemed almost more clearly like an invitation, which is from the famous anthropologist Levi Strauss, that the proof of the analysis is in the synthesis, right? So let's get synthesizing. So the first thing I'm going to do is model a piece that is called Agatarumo, and I'm sure I'm mispronouncing it like all good people who learn things from books rather than conversation. But I'm sure probably a lot of people in the room have encountered that as well. But it's a programmatic model of a piece of music that in the book is captured by using Western music notation, the dots. So Agatarumo is a drum piece consisting of 3 drums. So there's the child drum, the highest one, and the way that drum's part works is there's an underlying model and there's a bunch of variations on it. So Arom kind of goes and lists these out longhand, but I think we can do a bit of a better job because we're programmers. If I just look at this rhythm here, I'm representing it in closures data structure, so it's kind of, just think of it like JSON and you won't go far wrong. And it consists of 3 notes only. One that happens at time 0 of duration 2/5 of a beat, a next one that has a duration of 3/5, and then finally one that has 5/5 or 1. So there's this original model, and then we have a bunch of different functions that we apply to the model to produce the different variations. So each variation is just a function of what you've done to the base model of the music to produce that particular instantiation of the pattern. So we've just created a couple of functions that are customized to this kind of music. So we're able to create new symbols, create new subroutines, because this is programming, that just splits 2 notes in half, or rather splits a note at 5/5, splitting a 1/5 of a beat off the front of it, and another one at the note at 6/5. So basically what we've done is we've produced a model of how this music functions. We've produced this concept of splitting beats. And then if we, this won't be readable, so don't worry, but what it effectively produces is a list of a whole bunch of different variations of that same part. So we've been able to kind of model that quite precisely. And also model the relationship between different variations. So the B variation is a functional composition of the A variation with an extra split. So we're able to describe kind of the, how this music is put together, how its inside functions. So all we do is the part just brings these all together into this kind of massive data. There's 2 other parts that function in almost exactly the same way, and they all have quite a few variations. But what that lets us do is it lets us write a program that randomly chooses from those variations, which is how Arom describes the process, and then plays the result. So actually, rather than just notating a particular example of this being played, this program captures the non-determinism in the iteration. So what this says, if you don't read closure, is we take the drums, which are the child, mother, and father part. We map random variations function across it. So we randomly choose, and then we concatenate together. So we pick one variation, and then pick another to play infinitely. We introduce the parts successively. So not everyone starts at once because there's no conductor. So the person with the highest pitched instrument starts, and then the others come in. And then we play it at a particular tempo. So this is what it sounds like. Another drum coming in. And then the third one coming, that's the father. If you're interested, this is kind of in a cycle of 5. So So that's quite complex, right? It's hard to kind of pick out the individual parts. You can see why, if you just heard that music the first time, and if you're in Bangui and you're a Rom, that you'd wonder, well, how do I understand the order that is present in this music? And so that's kind of where the polyrhythm of the book comes in. So those different parts, they're kind of playing competing rhythms. They're not clearly based around the one underlying 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. They're all playing off against each other. And that's what creates the complexity over time. And actually, if you think about how many variations each individual part has, you could actually play that song for quite a long time before actually having repetition. So you have this ostinato with variation. You have kind of repetition, but kind of infinite variation, kind of vertical interest. So that's Argatarume, that's one piece. I want to relate this to maybe a more well-known piece of music called clapping music, which is by an American composer, Steve Reich. So a lot of Steve Reich's music operates by similar logic to that of the bandolinda and other Central African Republican musical traditions. But it produces variation in a slightly different way. So hopefully this will be readable. But this operates in exactly the same way as the music code for the previous piece. It's a program that generates that kind of JSON data structure. So you take the African bell pattern, which is something that's a kind of a widely used rhythm. You do ostinato, which I told you is repetition. So you repeat that over and over and over again. And we're going to give that to the mother drum. And then we accompany that with another version of the same thing, the African bell pattern. But every 4 times we repeat it, we add in an extra note. And then we repeat that forever. So what that means is, this is what Steve Reich called his phasing technique. So you have 2 parts, and one is gradually slipping out of phase with the other. And this is actually something that's quite closely related to the earlier music I played. And Reich has specifically been influenced by a Rom, maybe not for this piece, but overall he cites a Rom as an influence. So here's Steve Reich's clapping music. That's the rhythm. It's going to slip out of time about now. Hear both parts. So we've got this constantly evolving rhythm as the 2 copies of the same rhythm slowly slide out of phase. Cool. So I was in 2 minds actually about whether to play that, because it's definitely like related musically. But one of the things that I'm afraid of falling into the trap is the same one as we discussed with Bartok earlier, which is I kind of inadvertently told you you should care about this Central African music because it's been blessed by tension with a Western composer, right? So there's a kind of a hypocrisy there in that. So there's the same problem of appropriation that when people gain inspiration from music from other cultures, that's a great thing, and it's not kind of in itself bad. But if it means that the original source of the music is lost, that's a bit icky. That's not great. So far we've just talked about percussion. So things that don't have a pitch, or at least they do have a pitch, but that pitch doesn't really play a function in the music. So what I want to talk about a little bit more is that second piece I said I'd simulate, which is the wind instruments with the 20 players playing 1 note each. So we need pitch for that, because they each have 1 pitch. But before I get to there, we have to develop our model of music a little bit more. So I'm going to talk about scales. Hopefully this will make sense to folks. So what I want to get to the point is where the scale of the music that I'm modeling, I want to be able to describe that with the natural numbers. So I want to be able to say, you know, play the first note, second note, third note of that scale. So if we look just at the paragraph I've just highlighted there, that's a way of notating the A major scale, which I'll just play. Right, and I think I'm actually not that happy with that so far, right? So if you look at the raw frequencies, they kind of seem arbitrary. The structure inherent in the frequencies of this scale are not at all visible, right? So if I'd made a mistake and it's not 554, it's supposed to be 564, it'd be really unobvious in this structure. So there's a lot of potential for me, if I was working with raw frequencies of the notes, to have my own B semi-flats, right? Where I introduce things that aren't supposed to be there, or I miss things, or I make a mistake. It's not a very good demonstration of the music that we're talking about. And it's also, maybe if you think in terms of type system, it makes a lot of illegal states representable, right? There's a lot of states that aren't notes in the scale that are just able to be notated there. So if I just went, you know, 564, like, it'd be really hard to know. So what we want to do is we want to use programming to index into that scale so that we can represent it with the natural numbers, and so we can take care of just what the notes we want to play, and the model takes care of mapping that onto the actual frequencies. So one way of doing this that gets us part of the way is MIDI. So MIDI is a way of numbering each of the keys on a piano, basically. So what we've got here, we look at this other version, is almost exactly the same as the one where we notated the raw frequencies, except we're modeling it a bit better. So we've notated the frequencies using MIDI codes, 69, 71, 73. These are the numbers of the piano keys that correspond to what we want. And then we use a function, MIDI to hertz, to map back to the frequencies. So that does a little bit of exponential maths. It's kind of quite easy if you want to look into it. But basically, all we need to know is we can now work in MIDI rather than raw frequencies. And so our model is a little bit better. And now we have fewer illegal states we can represent because we're only working in MIDI. We're not going to accidentally create a B semi-flat. So it should sound exactly the same. But it's still a little bit arbitrary. So I said I wanted to use the natural numbers. But this is starting just kind of randomly, like halfway between 0 and 100. Like, what's special about that? And as it happens, if I tried to play 0 MIDI, it would just be really low and kind of, that's not where I want to be in the scale. So I still haven't got the model quite right because the natural notes of the scale are kind of way up there offset. So I can do a little bit better than that, which is I can create another function which represents the different keys. And all this function does is it represents that offset. So the key of A is just a function that adds 69 to a relative MIDI to give an absolute MIDI. So what that means for how I can notate things is that I can now just specify starting from 0. So I can specify the A major scale, but with 0 to 4, rather than 69, 71, 73, or whatever. So if I play this again, it should, unless I've made a mistake, should still work the same. And the way that I've then converted back is I've just got the functional composition of A, which adds 69 to everything, and MIDI to hertz, which maps it to the frequency. But still, you might notice that there are still illegal states that I haven't excluded, like 1 doesn't appear in this scale, and it actually shouldn't be there. Maybe I play 1, and we'll see how it should sound a bit weird, the first 3 notes. Yeah, so my model still allows for that. So if I go to scales, what scales do is they represent the patterns between the allowed notes. So a major scale has a gap of 2, or a jump of 2 from its first to its second note. So we skip 1 note, and we skip another note, we don't skip, 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 we don't. So these 2s and 1s here represent the difference between successive notes in the scale I'm playing. So with that, I can actually finally play the natural numbers. So now I'm just playing the pitches from 0 to 7. And because I've got my functions that I've composed together, it maps properly into the scale. So this is great. But so far, I'm only dealing with what are actually Western music scales. So these 7-note scales, major and minor, are what European music is written in. But actually, the whole reason why I introduced this topic is that the Central African music of the bandolinda that Arom talks about don't use these scales. And so actually, Western music notation kind of has an embedded assumption we'll be using scales like this with 7 notes in. But we can do a little bit better, and we can shape our notation for this particular use case. So they use descending pentatonic scales. So rather than having jumps of 1 and 2 between notes, they have fewer notes, they have 5 of them, and they have jumps of 2 or 3. So this is what the pentatonic scale should sound like. So it kind of has a bit of a different feel to it. And so now what I'm doing is I'm using the natural numbers still, but I'm indexing into a pentatonic scale. So I've got a good model, but it's of a different alternative scale. So that's one thing, 2 fewer notes to the scale. So two states that were representable in the major scale that I've now excluded because they are not used in this music. But the other thing that I think is maybe a more interesting aspect of Central African music is scales are thought of in the reverse order. So, excuse me, in Western music we start low and we build up through the scale to get high, and that's how I've played all the scales so far. But as Central African musicians conceptualize music, they don't think of low and high frequency. They think of small and big sounds. That's how people's mental model of the music works. So you start with the smallest sound, made by the smallest instrument, and then you progressively move to the big sounds. So you could say they think in terms of wavelength, whereas European music thinks in terms of frequency. So in the end, the same thing, but kind of an inverted way of approaching it. So what I can do is I can produce a descending scale just with another function stacked in this thing. So now if I play a descending apentatonic, so I can play the natural numbers, but now it actually plays an appropriate scale for this kind of music. So the reason why I've brought all that up is what I want to do is I want to play a wind instrument piece that has pitch. And I want to use that model of the scale to represent how the pitch is going to work. So Nigeria Ballandoro, which I'm sure I'm pronouncing completely wrong, is a piece for 18 musicians, each of which has a pitched instrument. So the model they have is much the same as the drum piece. So we have a basic model, which has pitch, time, and duration now. And it also has variations. So we have the same kind of variation. The A variation is just by splitting a note. The B variation is a composition of the A variation and splitting another note. We've actually got a couple of other concepts as well here. So there's a concept of an accent note, which I said they could only play one pitch. There's actually a way that the musicians can play like a slightly higher note just to give what they're doing emphasis. And I've also got the concept of skipping a note, which is self-explanatory. So just like I did with the drum parts, here's 4 different variations on the same horn theme. And the same process goes for the tar, the ha, the tululi, and the bongo, which are parts in this particular piece. So before I play the piece as a whole, what I want to do is I want to just play the first individual single part, which will give you a little bit of an insight. Because once we play the whole thing, like Arom, you'll probably struggle to pick out the individual detail, and you'll hear the overwhelming mosaic of how it's put together. You won't hear the individual parts. So here is just the tete part. Right. So bear that in mind. That's what an individual musician is doing when we come to play the whole piece. So now we'll put together the first 5 parts. So each of these have one note in a pentatonic scale. And like the other music, we're going to introduce it successively. So the person with the highest note is the leader, and then everyone follows the person who has the higher instrument than them. Whoops. Sorry, what I didn't do is I didn't reevaluate, so now I will. Now let's try that again. All right, introducing new parts. I think that sounds quite pleasant, but those harmonies aren't European harmonies. They're not made in the same way that European music is made. And it's kind of I find it actually kind of hard to imagine playing that music myself, just hitting that one note naturally in between all the other notes is it's almost a percussive way of approaching music. But I said there was going to be 18 musicians, and that was just 5. So you might wonder, well, where are the other 13, right? So basically, with scales, when you go through, say, the 5 notes of a pentatonic scale or the 7 notes of a heptatonic scale, what you end up doing is kind of wrapping around. So you have a new note that's almost just like a higher or lower version of the other one. And that's how the bandolindo music works as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce big versions of all those 5 parts. And all big is just it's just a function that goes through and lowers the frequency of all those by an octave. I'm going to do big, big. So I'm trying to use big just to try to get in the mindset of these are about bigger sounds, not about lower sounds. And there's actually even like a few notes that have big, big, big versions of 3 of the horns. So if we play this, what we'll end up doing is successively bringing in all 18 musicians, and you'll hear the effect. You've heard it just kind of in one version there, but you should also, if you concentrate on different parts of the scale, you should be able to hear those kind of repetitive rhythms like all throughout the mosaic. That's the top. Introducing another one. Lower and lower coming in. Unlike European music, it doesn't really have a well-defined beginning, middle, and end, right? So that will continue until the master of the horn says, okay, well, they give a signal, maybe like a samba band or something like that. Okay, now we finish up. So it's really quite a fascinating piece of music. And this is a little bit of it written out in Western music notation. And you might think that's not the whole piece. That's actually just 2.5 rounds, because each of those individual lines is actually a separate notation for each individual part. So I would claim that this doesn't really express a lot of the structure of the music that we've been able to do in code. So there's kind of and 2 angles that it doesn't. One of which is this doesn't represent that kind of non-determinism and repetition that is part of the mechanics of how the music actually comes to life. The other thing is that this is still built around heptatonic scales. So there's like 2 notes of the scale that aren't notated there, but you couldn't tell just really by looking at it. There's a couple of lines that if you put a dot on it, you would have actually made a mistake. Because the music is built for European music. The music notation is built for European music. So I'm just going to quickly finish up with a bit of the philosophical implications, right, of using this way of representing music. So this is really a process of compilation. So we want to have an expressive notation, but we want to have a simple kind of end format that we execute. So that's not that dissimilar to Grace Hopper's work, and COBOL goes all the way back there. Maybe a more recent relevant example is to think about how Java, Clojure, Scala, Frege, other JVM languages all compile down to the same bytecode. So you have the ability to have very different ways of looking at the world, models, notation, but you can compile it down to a common point. So you almost have like a mutual intelligibility. You can have interchange between these languages. You can have an understanding of stating what Clojure does in terms of Scala. And maybe a more relevant example for the music I've done so far is emitting OSC messages from Overtone. So emitting open sound control messages. So that's a data format. I found a really good quote, and this is thanks to Tommy Hall, who gave a talk actually based on a similar pattern, but with talking about Puppet and how to provision infrastructure as code, which is the language to represent the data should be a simple data-only format, and programmatic modification of this data should be done in a real programming language. Right? So it almost sounds literally about what we're trying to do with music. But this is about Borg, Omega, and Kubernetes. So this pattern of having a rich programming language that emits a model is quite an interesting one. So you might ask, well, if we've represented music as code, does that mean we've like purged the cultural bias? Because lambda calculus is like universal, right? Well, not quite, right? So algorithms encode bias. So it might make it easier to spot that you've put that there, but it doesn't, it doesn't eliminate it. And one good example is why I have chosen not to synthesize the choir music. So in a language that's a tonal language, the actual meaning of the lyrics and the melody are intrinsically coupled. So I didn't actually feel that the data format that I had was actually good enough to include all the relevant characteristics of vocal music from tonal languages. The people writing this stuff are Western. So the most problematic thing about this book for me, even though I love it, is that the musicians from the Central African Republic aren't named. The people who are named are other Western academics that Arom is either agreeing or disagreeing with. So that's kind of a bit uncomfortable to me. And maybe this way of stating music is a Western conceit. So this kind of contextless representing of music as pieces of data and isolated kind of dots floating in space. Well, that's not necessarily that authentic a way of understanding this music. Most of the music in this book have cultural functions. They're done to celebrate certain things or when certain things happen. So I've kind of like lost all that meaning. And it might be an easy way to think about it if you're a Westerner would be, if I asked you to explain what the wedding march means, if you just told me the chord progression, you probably would have missed a lot of the detail of it. So I think that using computational ethnomusicology, which is the slightly academic term for this, might give us a better way of articulating the models and the understanding we come to, but it doesn't really do anything to fix the bias in the framing of our questions. So it's a good step, but it's not a free ticket out. So, in conclusion, rather than using a score as a model, which is both a notation and a representation, if we can split those two things into a program that can be expressive, that generates representation that can be basic, then we can have many notations for one representation so that we can understand the relationship between our notations, so we can understand the relationship between how we're phrasing Western music and how we're phrasing different kinds of Central African music. The notation can be really customized and specific. We can introduce stuff into it that is just for the kind of music that we're looking at now, because we don't have to worry about burdening the language with stuff that's irrelevant for most use cases. We can actually just build in stuff for that specific instance, which is really useful. And the representation can be really generic and simple because it's compiled. So we can reuse infrastructure like the synthesizers, and more to the point, it gives us a point of mutual intelligibility between the musics. So I would say that as programmers, we have sophisticated mechanisms for abstraction, so kind of pulling things apart, and composition, putting them back together again, which lets us achieve open world languages that have mutual intelligibility. And I think that's a very interesting area for people who are trying to represent different musical systems to explore. Thanks very much. Do I have any time for questions? Or cool. Is there any questions anyone has? Sure. Yeah.
In the last you played.
Yeah.
What frequencies were you using for the notes?
Yeah.
Specifically, what I want to ask is, were the frequencies of the notes that you used in those final songs?
Yeah.
Do those frequencies exist on Western scales?
Right.
It sounds like they do.
So that is actually an element from the model that I didn't include. So, so the question was, do the frequencies that I played in the final piece exist on Western scales? So the simple and slightly wrong answer is yes, because the pentatonic scale is basically major scale but with notes missing. But the slightly more correct answer is that the temperament of Central African music isn't equal temperament. So I've used, just for simplification's sake, I've used an assumption that all notes are kind of equally spaced across the frequency spectrum. And that's not actually true for Central African music. So if I were to do it maybe a little bit more authentically, then we'd be having slightly different frequencies in the raw output. And that's actually a really good advantage to using music as code because it lets you represent that. But I didn't include that bit in the talk today. Cool. Yeah?
Have you been able to run this by anyone from the Central African Republic?
That's a good question. No, I haven't yet. I hope that if there's anyone here today who's from the band Linda, then that would be really welcome. But no, I haven't. So my validation, and you're right that this is kind of hypocritical because it doesn't match the standard set by Arom in the book, is to compare it to recordings of that tradition. So I guess if I'm missing something, then I would also be missing it when I'm checking the results. So yeah, that's a very problematic part of it. Yeah, yeah.
As we transition
Yeah.
sessions, can you play the music?
Well, to walk you out, to signal you out. All right, I'll play it again when we come to that, sure, yeah. Anyone else? Oh, yeah.
Super briefly, could you tell us what's happening technically from when you push the button to
Right. Basically, sorry, the question was, could I briefly say technically what's happening when I push the button, right? So what I'm using is I'm using Clojure, and I'm using a Vim plugin. So I'm executing code from inside Vim, which is kind of just a nice workflow. Specifically, I'm using a system called Overtone, which is a JVM wrapper for the Super Collider Synthesis server. So what's happening is we generate this sequence of notes, and then that's a lazy sequence that the underlying infrastructure is just pulling out, examining, and sending to Super Collider one at a time. So it's actually, like, there's not very much there. The code for this is all online, as is the slides. So if you wish to investigate further, you can. Cool. All right, one more.
I'm not sure I totally got what
Yeah.
happened when the split bit was happening. Because it's splitting into two separate notes, extending.
Yeah, just from my examination, so the question was when split happened, what was that actually doing? So it's just a relatively simple function that seeks out a note and produces two new notes with a break in the middle. Because, yeah, so there was one and then there's two. Because most of the variations can be kind of explained simply as just kind of adding in extra notes. Cool. All right, probably time to finish up now. Thanks very much.